This is a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Rauda. This show is all about helping us grow as leaders, become better technologists, and improve our lives both at work and at home. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a lot. Hello, world, and welcome to a Geek Leader podcast. I'm your host, John Rauda. Today's sponsor is A2 Hosting. I've been using A2 Hosting solid-state hosting solutions for our website at geekleader.com for many, many years now, and absolutely love their support, their service, and all the features that you get. You get access to cPanel. You get all of the things that you can imagine for a great WordPress experience, including their A2 optimized WordPress, which does extra security checks, extra lockdown. You can lock down your editor file so you can't edit anything inside there. You get alerts whenever there are file changes that are done. You can also do automatic updates, backups, and more with A2 Hosting. So highly recommend it. Go to geekleader.com/A2 to get more information and to sign up for their solid-state, turbocharged speed hosting today. Again, that's geekleader.com/A2. All right, Geek Leaders, today I'm honored to have Nick Means on the show. He is a software engineer turned engineering leader, currently the VP of engineering at SIM, and host of a podcast called Managing Up. We're going to talk a little bit about his transition period from engineering to engineering leadership, which I know we've talked about with different guests in the past, but it's always interesting to get a fresh perspective of that. And then we'll talk, just kind of go from there and talk about leadership and the importance that comes with. Anyway, Nick, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, John. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, if you don't mind, just tell the audience a little bit about your background and kind of how you got to where you are today in your career, and what is it that you guys do over at SIM?
Yeah, for sure. So let me start with the SIM piece. So at SIM, we're working on building a tool chain for authorization and approval workflows for software engineering teams. So kind of companies that are HIPAA or working on their SOC 2, something like that. It's easy to get a checklist for what you need to do to get compliant with those various compliance regimes. It's a lot harder to put the controls in place in a way that doesn't absolutely destroy your engineering team's velocity and make life really painful. And so we're building an engineering-first tool focused on putting those controls in place in a way that really supports engineering teams. It's a lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun to work on. As far as me, how I kind of got where I am, I started poking around with software when I was a kid, as is true for many folks that were kind of early 1980s vintage, playing with Apple IIs, programming in Apple Basic. Really was kind of a hobby for me. And then got into software development, working freelance for a small company in the town near where I grew up, transitioned into the industry from there, and did a lot of work. Got lucky to stumble onto Ruby on Rails early in the life cycle of that framework. I think I was working with Rails in like version 1.1, 1.2, somewhere in there, and really kind of cut my teeth in that world. The thing that's interesting about Ruby as a technology is it's very human focused. It's a language that's designed to be read by humans, written by humans. It's really focused on what the people writing it need versus what the computer needs. And the culture that's sprung up around it is kind of the same way. So I was going to these conferences with other Ruby people, meeting other people in the Ruby community, and they were all just really nice, really wonderful people. And then kind of experiencing your traditional work environment, kind of locker room culture, loudest voice wins, and had this inkling that I could do better kind of based on what I was seeing in the Ruby community and what I was hearing in podcasts from other Ruby folks. Particularly, there was an episode of Ruby Rogues that Alex Harms was on. She talked a lot about Brené Brown and the work Brené Brown has done around shame and vulnerability. And that really informed kind of my early approach to how would I do engineering leadership different. I like to joke that I'm the only person that ever made that decision on purpose and then stuck with it. But I got over onto the people leadership side and really loved it. Really liked the impact that I was able to have building a team that was safer and more collaborative than kind of the standard for the day. Those things are becoming more common, still not all over the place, but certainly more common now than they were back then. And just really enjoyed the impact I was able to have with the people I got to work with.
Yeah, that's awesome. Brené Brown's got some really good content out there. I've read a couple of her books, and she has I think there's a special on Netflix that she put out too.
Anyway, I've not seen that yet. I've watched her TED Talk. I don't know,
her TED Talk
many times.
Yeah. She's got a lot of
good stuff. And one of my managers that reports to me, she's actually she got a master's in psychology. She talks a lot about Brene Brown. She's one of her best fans, I guess you would say. But no, that's cool. I think you're right about you choosing leadership being one of the rare ones that shows that versus being kind of pulled into it or dragged into it. It is kind of a interesting phenomenon there. So when you decided to take that venture, now I do want to talk a little bit about conferences too, but we'll get to that in a minute. When you took that approach and said, I can do better, and I want to take this challenge on and move forward, what were some of the resources that you picked up on? You mentioned podcasts, you mentioned talks that you watch and TED Talks and things like that. What are some other resources that people can kind of go after if they are taking that step intentionally, or like I did, kind of unintentionally?
There's a bunch of good books out there now that weren't out back then. I'm trying to remember what specific resources I would have used at the time. Nowadays I would point somebody to Sarah Drasner's book or Laura Hogan's book or Camille Fournier's book. All three are excellent kind of overviews of what things you need to master to be a good line manager kind of out the gate. Back then there wasn't much. The common path for somebody getting into management 10 years ago in technology, kind of when I did, was, okay, we can't really promote you any further on the IC side of the house, so let's move you over to manager and see how you do. Good luck. And that good luck was about all of the resources that you got. Anymore, the books are great. There's a lot of events out there. I'm speaking at Lead Dev London later this month.
Cool.
And that conference has been great for me over the years, learning more and more about the craft and honing in on what I like to do. And then a book that is particularly meaningful to me that I tend to recommend to everybody getting into management is Turn the Ship Around by David Marquet.
I love that book.
It's probably my favorite business book, and it's probably done more to inform my leadership style, or maybe even post facto justify some of it, than anything else. Just the idea of if you can make a high agency, high autonomy workplace work on a nuclear submarine in the middle of a very hierarchical military, you can do it anywhere.
Yeah, I love the way in that book he talks about how he just changed the way, instead of him saying the command and them repeating it back, making them say the command, and just changing that one little thing in the order. It gave people the responsibility to take ownership, and I love that part of that book. And I've taken that into my leadership journey as well. That's one of my favorite leadership books. I'm glad you mentioned that one because I almost forgot about it. It's been so long since I've read it.
It's funny, when I was starting at SEM, I had just come out of, I spent 3 years at GitHub as a director of engineering, leading the supply chain security group at GitHub. Mm-hmm. And as I was stepping out of that environment and into the role of VPE, where I knew I was going to be directly responsible for process and culture and things like that, that was actually the first thing I did, was reread that book just to get that loaded back into my head, get that perspective fresh so that I could approach this new challenge with kind of that in mind.
Yeah, I think that's a great call out for that resource. I'm glad you mentioned that. One of the other things that I noticed about military leaders is that we always have this idea that it's always, yes sir, and you do what that is. But I've had a lot of Navy SEALs on the podcast and generals and things like that, and they always go to the point that it's more about being a supportive leader and a servant leader versus just that command and control. And it seems like all the great leaders go into, even from the military, have that more servant leadership mindset. How have you discovered that when you've met people at conferences and talked to people about leadership?
I think you're right. I think that is a thing that I'm trying to think if I can actually make this statement. I think I can say that every leader that I would consider to be a good leader has fallen more on the servant leadership side of that spectrum.
Yeah.
And I think honestly, it comes kind of down to illusion of control, right? So if you're a command and control leader, that presumes that you actually have control of the environment that you're operating in. And that's always an illusion. You never actually have full control because humans make independent decisions. You can't control every decision a person on your team makes. There's nobody that has that amount of bandwidth. And so, once you're kind of at home with that idea, then the only thing you can really do is to shift towards this mindset where, okay, I'm going to try to create an environment and an information context where the people that I'm supporting have the information they need to make good decisions and understand the expectations of those decisions. And I don't need to be there for every decision. And I think, there's a quote, I think it's in the effective executive, maybe, that Peter Drucker talks about an interview with this sergeant that was on the front lines in Vietnam. And so a reporter had asked this guy, how do you maintain control of your troops when you're in the chaotic theater of war? And this young Sarge said back, well, at the end of the day, they're actually the ones that are in control. I'm just the one that's responsible for their decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is a really uncomfortable truth that every leader probably needs to spend a little bit of time sitting with.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point, because and I see it now more than ever, now that I've been kind of in an executive role for a little bit of time. I've kind of lost some of my technical expertise in certain areas. Like, I have a great understanding of concepts. I can go and write code if I need to, but then something new will pop up and I'll hear a term and I've got to look to my security engineer, kind of like let him dictate which way we're going to go, because these are things that I'm not aware of. I did not stay on top of, all my cybersecurity stuff the way I should have, because I have a good team to rely on. And I'm ultimately responsible if there's a breach or something like that, but I need to make sure that my people are, have all the knowledge and they control these situations. That kind of reminds me, have you ever read the book Extreme Ownership?
I'm familiar with it, but I haven't read it.
Yeah. So in that book, they talk a lot about how, like, the leader takes ownership of everything, but they're not the ones in control. And I think that's a really cool point that you brought up there. Moving back into conferences, tell me a little bit about what you gained from conferences, and for maybe leaders that haven't had the opportunity to go to a lot of them, because I really enjoy, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot from sessions, but I learned more from the time in between sessions. But I want to know what you get out of conferences and what benefits you've seen of attending them.
I was going to make the exact same point. I'm to the point that I get more out of the so-called hallway track than I do the general sessions most of the time. I don't know that was really true for me until I started speaking. I tend to be a pretty deep introvert, so I kind of went to my first few conferences and I did just sit in the sessions, and I met a person or two here and there, but not a lot of people until I started speaking. And then I suddenly didn't have the small talk burden to worry about when I was meeting new people, because they would come up to me and talk to me about whatever it was that I just talked about. So that was being able to speak at conferences has been a really big career hack for me, because I've met a ton of people. I've gotten a ton of opportunities just by being able to get up on stage and tell stories. But
that's really interesting, because I haven't had the experience of really attending very many conferences that I wasn't speaking at.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to that little career hack, when I was a software engineer working for a company, that we didn't pay people to go to conferences. Like, that was not a perk for this company that I worked for. So the only way I could even attend is if I got there for free as a speaker or paid my own way. So I figured out that, hey, if I just apply to speak, they'll pay for me to go to the conference. It'll be free, So I would do that so I could attend conferences just to learn. So I've kind of started my whole career at conferences just as a speaker. So I think that's interesting to hear from the other perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it's for sure been a difference maker to me. And even to this day, when I go to a conference that I'm not speaking at, I really kind of don't know what to do with myself.
Yeah, I'm an introvert as well. One of the things that I found is that I force myself to eat lunch with people I don't know.
Yep.
Like, just go find an empty seat that's next to someone, so they kind of have to engage.
Yep, for sure.
And take that path. I think that's interesting. Also, when I'm booking my tracks at the conference and making my little schedule, I make sure I attend every other session. So I have a session where I'm just kind of wandering around, and hopefully I'll bump into somebody and start up a conversation.
Oh, I like that strategy. I'm gonna have to try that.
Otherwise you feel like you're always going from one place to another. But if you have this 45-minute period where you're just kind of roaming around, you're gonna talk to a vendor, you're gonna talk to somebody that's sitting around and get a conversation somewhere. And a lot of times, if you're a speaker, you have these speaker rooms that they have set up. So I'll just go in there and sit down, and if I see someone not really focusing on practicing their talk or working on their slides last minute, I'll try to start up a conversation with someone.
Yeah, definitely.
So one of the things that I was really intrigued by your career was that transition from engineering to engineering leadership, and you've already mentioned kind of that that as a leader that you're not always in control, but you are responsible. What has been some of the other epiphanies that you've kind of discovered going through that transition period?
That's a good question.
Like, for example, one of the things that I noticed that was really apparent to me was the fact that I didn't scale.
Yeah.
And I kind of, I wanted to be like, even as a team lead, I was sort of like the path that everything kind of went through one way or another. But then when I got into management and I had multiple teams, it was not feasible to have that role anymore. And I had to give up that responsibility, and realizing that I didn't scale was kind of a big epiphany for me.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, one of the more interesting things that I've wrestled with a little bit in my career is the idea of balance between what's in the interest of the people on my team and what's in the interest of the company. Because sometimes those things come into conflict.
Yeah.
And as a manager, you're put in a role where your job is to always be in balance of the company, make sure that your team is doing what's right for the company. But there's situations where that kind of burning the candle at both ends or pushing the team through a sprint that maybe they don't have to go through.
Mm-hmm.
It's not in their interest, and maybe it's not in the interest of the company either, because then they'll have to pay off that debt, or you might burn out a key engineer and they might leave the company. So always kind of playing that chess match out in my head to figure out what is the way that I can get this team to show up best for the company, and also still have their interests in mind, so that I'm not being purely extractive in the way that I lead the team. It has been an interesting journey for me.
Yeah, that is interesting, because a lot of times, those are in a line, but there's every now and then where they're not in alignment. You have to kind of make that judgment call of what is the best thing, long-term for the company, but maybe not the best short-term for my team.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, and when you do, I think, you can, if you've done the work to build up the trust with the team,
Mm-hmm.
you can bring that honest truth to the team and go, look, I know this is going to be painful. This is not an ideal situation. Here's why, as your leader, I think it's worth us going through this, and kind of win them over to that cause.
Yeah, for sure. Sounds like you're talking a lot about transparency with your team there. How important is it, do you see, as from a leadership perspective, to be transparent with your team?
I mean, I think, one of the examples that I talk about in one of my talks is shin umbrella versus heat shield.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you kind of shift into that umbrella mode, where you're not being transparent with the team, where you're kind of hiding the bureaucracy you're operating within from the team completely, you're just putting yourself in a place where you're going to burn out. And it's not a very healthy place to be. The thing we don't think about as often is being exposed to some of that bureaucracy is actually important for teams to learn.
Yeah.
Like, everybody on your team needs to learn how your company works, how decisions get made at your company. And sometimes getting into that is kind of like, visiting a sausage factory. They don't really want to see it. But it's important, because that's the context that they're operating in. And hopefully, as their careers continue and grow, they're going to be in more and more rooms like that. So if you as a leader can give them more of that perspective instead of trying to absorb it all, if you can be more transparent with them, I think it can be really transformational from a career growth perspective.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think our jobs as leaders is to grow our team, grow them in their career, grow them in their knowledge, their skill sets, their abilities, and to have an effective team, if you want to improve your team's output, you've got to improve the individual within your team. And I think exposing them in moderation to some of that bureaucracy is important. And I did the same thing, like even with budgets. That was one of the things that, as a developer, my manager shielded me completely of budgets. And then when I got promoted into management, it was like, someone opened up the fire hose and said, "Here, you have to know how to budget things." What the heck is this?
Yeah.
So I bring my team along the budget journey. As we're preparing our annual budget, we'll talk about it. And I've kind of pushed some of that, like the firewall budgets over to the security engineering lead to kind of like take a look at that, give me information, help me, and then review the final budget with, my core team, so that they're not just, experiencing it a little bit, but they're also on board with it before I go and present it.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's important. And then they have that context when they ask for something later in the year. They already know the budget. Yeah. They generally have some idea of if you're going to be able to say yes or no. And when you say no, they have some reason, some idea why you're having to say no. It's not a personal thing. It's, hey, this is the reality of the numbers.
Right. And also gives them a little bit of ownership into the financial part, which is, a lot of times we're shielded from that as engineers or developers, or, we don't get to see that part. So I try to make sure they're brought into it. Like when I go to my Azure costs, I'm meeting my developers and say, look, this is our budget for Azure this year. So, Azure spinning up, instances, be mindful of that.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's really cool. I like your analogy of umbrella versus heat shield. I've never heard that before. Something that's really cool. So you mentioned that speaking was kind of your way of kind of getting out of your shell, and what was that first talk like?
So hilariously, the very first talk that I did was on imposter syndrome.
Mm.
And it ended up, as I was writing it, it was for RailsConf, which was a big event. I think 1,000, maybe 1,200 person conference at that point. And I was a little terrified to give a talk at RailsConf. And as I got into it, I realized that I was having imposter syndrome about the idea of getting up and giving a talk at RailsConf. And so it turned into this sort of meta narrative that went through the story of my reaction to giving a talk at RailsConf, coupled with research around imposter syndrome and kind of how I coped with that experience and what I learned from it. It was really a lot of fun.
Yeah, I've actually talked a little bit about imposter syndrome. I kind of embed that sometimes into my technology, one-on-one talk that I give sometimes about being a technology leader. And one of the things that I discovered with that is everybody has it.
Oh yeah, 100%.
At one level or another. Sometimes they're greater than others, obviously. But anybody that I've talked to, they've always feel like they don't deserve to be where they're at if they're successful. And sometimes if they're not successful, they have the same feeling. They're kind of tossed into it, which is really interesting. What are some of your tips of getting through the imposter syndrome?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons that everybody around us deals with it is because people that are in professions that are judged subjectively are more likely to suffer from it. So like actors and musicians, we sometimes overlook the fact that writing software is in itself a creative pursuit. We're doing creative problem solving, and there's not necessarily any objective standard out there for if we're doing our job well or not. And so that sort of predisposes people that are paying attention to their situation to imposter syndrome if they work in technology. So just knowing that it's a common experience to everybody, I think, is a big part of it. Yeah. The other thing that's helped me probably more than anything is when I get into one of those modes where I'm kind of beating myself up and thinking I've got everybody around me fooled, that sort of presupposes that everybody around you is dumb enough to be fooled in the first place. Mm. And usually a part of imposter syndrome is everybody around me is doing so much better than I am at this job, and I feel like my job performance is not up to snuff. That presupposes that everybody around you is smart. Well, they can't all be smart and dumb at the same time. So either they're dumb enough for you to fool, or they're smart as you think they are, but you belong as part of that group. And this kind of gets into Dunning-Kruger effect. When you are in those positions where you are well informed and you know a lot about the subject that you're operating in, you also know a lot about the things you don't know. And it's really easy to focus on those things.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's really cool to think about. If everyone is fooled, then they have to be dumb, and if they're dumb, they can't be that much greater than where you are. I think that's a really interesting kind of paradigm to think about, and I haven't even thought of it that way. I always thought of kind of like, what would if I am an imposter and shouldn't be here. I always thought about like, well, how did I get here?
Right.
And what was that path like? And if I go back to my successes and think about those, it kind of gives me more confidence into where I'm at now.
Yeah, 100%. I keep a nice things file on my computer to read on days when I'm feeling down about myself.
Nice things file. I like that.
And that's a tip I've given a lot of people. I also find myself talking a lot about the metaphor of highlight reels versus raw footage. Mm-hmm. So like when you're looking at other people around you and you're forming that basis of comparison, you're seeing their highlight reel. You're seeing all of the things that they've achieved without paying much attention to what they went through to get there. Whereas when you look at your own life, your own achievements, your own job performance, you're seeing all of the raw footage that you left on the cutting room floor. You're not watching your own highlight reel. And that's by definition an unfair comparison.
Yeah. Stephen Furtick had a quote in one of his books, book creator, where it talked about how like, when you're looking at people's social media and things like that, you're looking at their highlight reels, and, you're talking about like MTV's Behind the Music. They used to have that series where they showed all the, things that were going on in the background, and you never saw that. And that's what you're seeing when you look at your own life. You're looking at the behind the scenes and everyone else's highlight reel. I think that's a really good analogy. That's kind of why I try to stay away from doom scrolling on social media, is because
Yeah.
that's all you're doing is kind of comparing yourself to everybody else's greatness, and you're never seeing the struggles. And you think about overnight successes, and everybody talks about, Apple was an overnight success, and
Yep.
no, it wasn't. It was a 12-year struggle.
Yeah. I mean, and you're also often comparing everybody else's definition of happiness to maybe a definition of happiness that you haven't really thought about. Like, it's easy to fall into this trap of seeing what everybody else is posting on social media and think that those are things that you need in your life without really stopping to consider what it is that would make you happy in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of times you don't realize that, you see that picture of that person on the boat. You're like, oh man, it's awesome. I wish I had a boat. But you don't realize that, like, boats are expensive. Boats have to be winterized. Boats have to have their spark plugs changed every year. You have to, there's a lot of maintenance that goes into a boat. And that one day out, you had to wash the boat. You had to put fuel in the boat. You had to, tow it and put it in the water, take it out of the water and clean it afterwards. And, there's a lot of work that goes into that you don't see, that you have to think about whenever you look at that success.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah. So what other advice would you have to someone that's getting a new leadership role, that got promoted and maybe now they're an engineering manager for the first time?
The other thing that I tend to talk about a lot with new leaders is the idea of meta productivity.
Okay.
You have to be able to. So as a software engineer, you have a really fast feedback loop, right? Like, you write code, thing happens on screen, tests pass, and that happens multiple times a day. So you're constantly getting that dopamine hit of going through that feedback cycle and getting positive feedback. When you shift into a leadership role, you don't get nearly as much of that. Your feedback cycles get a lot longer. Your success definitions get quarters, half years, years long sometimes. And so you have to kind of learn to build some satisfaction from seeing the people on your team go through that feedback loop over and over again. As they ship code, part of why they're able to ship code is the environment that you've set up and maintained on the team, the culture that you've built. And so you have to be able to see some of your contributions, some of your fingerprints in the work that the people on your team are doing. Otherwise, leadership is a very unfulfilling line of work because it takes too long to see the results of what you've done. Kind of along those lines, we're often tempted as new leaders to be super busy. We feel like we need to be out there doing things and showing that we're busy. And a lot of times you end up more interfering than helping when you get in that mindset, when you feel like you need to be doing a lot of actual hands-on work as a leader.
Yeah. There's a quote by, I think it's Tim Ferriss, that was, busyness is a form of laziness.
Yeah.
And, I realized that, kind of the hard way, because I was always trying to be super busy because I thought that made me a better leader. But then when I was so busy, I couldn't, focus in on, my people and growing them and spend time with them, that I turned into a bad leader, So
yeah, for sure. You have to have that margin. You have to have that time to think. And often the people on your team, that once a week or once every other week one-on-one cycle is important because it gives you a chance to give them feedback and then let them go run with it and do some things with it and then come back to you and tell you how it went a week from now.
Yeah,
but
hopefully surprise you.
Hopefully surprise you. Yeah, but if you're dropping in and you're giving guidance every single day,
Mm-hmm.
you're probably giving them too much feedback for them to be able to internalize or operate with.
Yep, absolutely. I think that's an important thing to realize, is that you've got to give, freedom to your team.
Yep.
And I like what you said about the margins, because there's a book, Accidental Creative by Todd Henry. He talks about how creativity happens in the margins. It doesn't happen in your daily structure. It happens on the outsides of that. And if you don't give people that space and you don't have that space, then it's not going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a piano in my office, and one of the reasons it's here is because that's one of the ways I can routinely get whatever problem I'm struggling with to drop into background processing. So I can, if something's really vexed me, I can hop on the piano and play piano for 20 or 30 minutes, and I will inevitably have made progress. I may not have solved it, but I will inevitably have made progress over that 30 minutes.
Yeah, and I get that with walks. I did the same thing with going outside and just taking a walk.
Yep,
So,
absolutely.
tell me a little bit about managing up and the importance of that, and why you talk about that.
Yeah, so the joke is, that's our podcast name, but it's really a clever pun. We didn't do our first episode on managing up until probably 2 years into the podcast.
Wow.
Which I think is really funny because it is a very important topic, and we probably should have talked about it earlier. It's like the importance of managing up is in order to give a team, I like to say I accumulate power in order to give it away. I like being in leadership roles because it gives me a lot of power to give away to the people on my team. But in order for that to happen, you need to be keeping the leadership above you in the loop as well. You need to be giving them the confidence they need to give you that power and freedom to give away. So, if you keep your leadership constantly informed, if you let them know what's going on so they don't feel like they're constantly having to come to you for status updates, it makes it a whole lot easier for them to trust you and give you room to operate. And also, it helps to see the folks in leadership above you as a resource that you have available when your team needs something. They're the ones that know the organizational pathways to get that thing done. They may do it for you. They may advise you on how to do it. But if you're not constantly having those conversations about what your team needs, what your team is lacking, then it's hard for them to hop in and help you and come alongside you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really good point too to mention that you have to keep them in the loop, because if you just surprise them once a quarter or at budget time with the things that you need, then it's like they're drinking from the fire hose. But if you keep them continually updated and you are transparent, and what I found is that bosses don't like fictitious sugarcoating. It's always, the grass is always greener. They want to hear the truth, and being transparent, open, and honest, and having that constant communication is really important.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. It's kind of interesting that you said you took 2 years to talk about it, because I'm imagining that there's more important things that you had to get to first.
I mean, we tend to be a lot on the human side of leadership. So we spend a lot of time talking about one-on-ones and things like that before we finally sat ourselves down and went, look, the name of the podcast is Managing Up. We should probably talk about it.
Yeah, for sure. I think one-on-ones are super important too. And that's, one of the things that I try to focus on with my team, as well as talking about it to make sure people know how to do a one-on-one. I think that's really important, because that's one of the things I've kind of learned over time, but the good things and the bad things to do and not to do to make them successful.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of different ways to do it, and there's a bunch of different ways to do it poorly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So real quick, if you don't mind, just give a couple of quick tips on how to do a successful one-on-one.
I think the first thing is make sure it is primarily their time, not yours. Mm-hmm. My goal in one-on-one is always to create space, always to create open conversation. And alongside that, the other tip that I would give is you don't have to talk about work stuff. So my goal is to build relationship and rapport with everybody that I manage. Because when you have that relationship, when something hard comes along, they will feel safe enough to bring it up, and it'll come up in that one-on-one. But if you're not constantly creating space, if you're not constantly building rapport and relationship, if you're only treating it as a way to get status updates and to give status updates, then you miss that whole side of the conversation that really makes it a valuable management tool.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're 100% right when it comes to making sure it's their time and their space. And a lot of times, what I've noticed is that I used to fall into the trap of one-on-one was a time for me just to talk at them and not listen. And, having to take that time to listen. And I usually do walking one-on-ones. We're outside or we're out of an office, because when you're in an office and, especially if someone has to come to my office, it's kind of intimidating. Yeah. And I don't like that. That does not create a welcome environment, giving someone space and freedom to talk. But going outside and walking around where we're on equal footing, we're side by side, it's great. And I never start talking about work. I always want to talk about what's up with your kids? How's your family life? You got any vacations coming up?
Yep.
And, if work comes into it, great. But if it doesn't, that's fine too.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't, that's the thing. We put this pressure on ourselves that everything we do has to be useful and productive. Mm. And that's not necessarily the case, especially with a one-on-one. It doesn't have to be productive. You can just talk to a person for 30 minutes and build relationship and rapport. And that may have been exactly what needed to happen in your one-on-one this week, because next week they may come back with something really hard from a team perspective that they're really struggling with.
Yeah, absolutely. Nick, this has been really good. How can people connect with you online, learn more about the things that you're doing, can find the podcast, learn more about SIM?
So for me personally, you can find me at my site, nmeans.dev. It's got some writing and some links to some of my talks. And then SIM, the best way to find out about what we're up to is our website, simops.com, SYMOPS.com. We've SIM is free for teams of up to 10 users. So if any of your users want to come and check it out, give it a try. We'd love any feedback that you have on the product, like good experiences, bad experiences. Also happy to help out. So
Awesome.
Please get in touch.
Yeah, and I'll link that up in the show notes too at geekleader.com. I'll link to your website, the podcast, SIM, all that good stuff, so people can find anything they want to find out about you there. Nick, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, John. It's been a lot of fun.
If you enjoyed that episode, please leave a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. I'd greatly appreciate that. And also, don't forget to check out merch. We have some T-shirts that I've designed that are on at geekleader.com. You can click on the merchandise section there and check that out. And also, don't forget about the books from our guests. So if you like this guest and other guests that have written books, please go ahead and check that out at geekleader.com. I would greatly appreciate it, and I'm sure they would too.